One topic that seems to generate a lot of interest and questions among real estate investors that I speak with is the topic of net operating income. Those who are new to real estate investing, and sometimes even those with experience, often seem unclear as to exactly what it is, what it means, how to use it. To shed some light on that topic, I'm going to try something new here, something that's new to me at least, and that's a video blog post. I'll try to answer those questions by giving you a basic roadmap of how net operating income is calculated and how it's used in real investment situations. So, here goes. As I said in my brief preamble, my purpose in this post is to discuss the subject of net operating income as it applies to income-producing real estate. Let's start off with what is net operating income, or NOI as it's usually called. Everyone in business or finance has probably encountered the term net income, and I'm sure you recognize its general meaning. What's left over after expenses are deducted from revenue. Hence, net income. That's pretty close to what we want here, but for our purposes as real estate investors, we do need to modify that definition just slightly. We're going to say instead that it's the difference between a property's revenue and its operating expenses. Now, if you picked up on my not-so-subtle change of inflection, you noticed that the difference here was that I emphasized operating expenses, not just expenses. We'll see just a little later why that difference matters. Let's start with the calculation of NOI, working our way from the top down. We'll look at the revenue first, and then the operating expenses, and finally, we'll arrive at the NOI. Once we've got that, we'll take a look at how it's used. A good way to figure a property's current NOI is to use a form called an Annual Property Operating Data, or APOD form. It's a straightforward way to show the revenue, the individual operating expenses, and the difference, which is the NOI. And FYI, I'm going to use the APOD form from RealData's investment analysis software, but just slightly abbreviated to fit this video screen. The revenue portion at the top of the form might look like this. Okay, this is an income property, so the most obvious form of revenue is the base rent. On our APOD, we actually call that top revenue line gross scheduled income, or sometimes potential gross income. This is the property's total annual revenue if all space were in fact rented and all of the rent actually collected. Now, for the sake of argument, let's say we have a small mixed-use property with a retail tenant on the ground floor and 4 apartments above. There's also an area for parking, where the apartment tenants can rent spaces if they choose. That means our gross scheduled income is really combined revenue from these 3 sources: the retail space, the apartments, and the parking. Revenue from the retail tenant could be just a simple flat amount, or more commonly it might be calculated based on the size of the space being occupied. Or to put it another way, how many rentable square feet is it that the retail tenant is using, and what's the rate per square foot? Let's say, for example, that they have 2,000 rentable square feet of space and pay $40 per square foot per year as rent. So 2,000 feet times $40 per foot means they have a base rent of $80,000 per year. But like many commercial tenants, they may also be required to pay something we would characterize as additional rent, something over and above the base rent. Not uncommon is a situation where the tenant reimburses the landlord for certain expenses, like property taxes or insurance. What's important to understand here is that if a tenant reimburses us, the landlord, for an expense or part of an expense, we should consider that as additional revenue, not as an offset that reduces our expense. I don't want to get us off track here, so at the end I'm going to refer you to some additional resources where you can learn more about how expense reimbursements work. But now for simplicity, we'll say that the retail tenant reimburses us for 1/2 of the annual property taxes. So the reimbursement, we'll say, is $6,000. Moving upstairs now to the apartments, let's say each of the 4 is rented for $1,000 per month. That makes $12,000 per year for each, $48,000 per year for the group of 4. I mentioned earlier that we have parking available to rent, parking for the apartment tenants. Let's say we collect $3,000 per year for this parking and treat this amount as other income. So here is what the revenue portion of our net operating income calculation looks like for the upcoming year. That's a total expected gross revenue of $137,000. Expected is an important word here, because you'll recall I said this was based on the assumption of total occupancy. Of course, we would like that to be true all the time, but in the real world, and even in the best of properties, there's a good chance that we'll experience some rent loss due to vacancy or even due to a failure of a tenant to pay as agreed. So we're going to make an allowance for vacancy and credit loss. Let's say we allow 3% of our potential revenue. 3% is $4,110. What's left after we subtract out that allowance, $132,890, is what we call the gross operating income. Sometimes you may see it referred to as effective gross income. Same thing, just a different name. Now, to get us from our gross operating income to our net operating income, we need to identify our operating expenses and subtract all of those out. So, operating expenses. This is the term that causes the greatest mischief. Many people say, if I have to pay it, then it's an operating expense. Well, that's not always true. In the second half of this post, we'll talk about what kinds of costs are good candidates to be considered operating expenses and what costs are not. Then we'll look at the net effect of all of this, the NOI, and see how that's used when you buy, sell, or finance income property.